Nick, antibiotic stewardship. It's basically stopping it becoming overused, I guess.
Exactly. Used appropriately is probably the right word, or the right way of putting it. So antibiotic use is really, it's come, under the firing line a lot, really, in recent times. The World Health Organization have marked the development of antibiotic resistance as a major factor facing the health of the world, really, of humanity around the world. And we're predicting that within the next 20 years we will all know people who will die because of sustaining infections that we just can't find a drug to
so straight resistance.
Exactly. And so, rightly or wrongly, and there's very stringent arguments both ways, the food animal industries around the planet have been targeted somewhat in regards to responsible use of antibiotics. And so I think we all have to face up to that and take some responsibility for it. And that means, although primarily the target falls on the likes of myself as a veterinarian, because I've of course got the prescribing rights to these drugs, but it means that all of the food animal industries have to play their part, and we all have to accept that we have to do things appropriately, and perhaps accept that maybe we have to do things a little bit better than we have in the past when it comes to appropriate use of antibiotics. There's some very simple rules of thumb that we really need to look at. So resistance development in bacteria can be pretty much paralleled really with parasite resistance. It works almost exactly the same way from a biological perspective. In other words, you drown a population of organisms that you don't want around with drugs to kill them, and there's always a small proportion that are going to be a little bit more resistant. And so as you keep up that saturation of that population with these drugs, that proportion of the organism that survives is going to get greater and greater and greater with each sustained time the drug's used. And so over time we can rapidly develop a large proportion of that particular type of organism, be it a bacteria or a parasite, that is no longer susceptible to the drug that we were reliant on.
So basically it may not be fitting well, but it's strong enough to be able to reproduce.
Exactly. So, yeah, that's exactly right. So after subsequent infections with the same population of bugs, maybe initially we might have had 1 in 10,000 of those organisms survive that insult with that antibiotic. Then over so many thousand more populations or reproductive cycles of
which won't take long.
Exactly, with bacteria, then we may end up with a situation where 25% of that population is resistant, and then we find ourselves in major grief. And so it doesn't take it's quite an easy concept to understand that one of the big issues is to stop exposure of these populations of bugs with subtherapeutic levels of antibiotics. So in other words, antibiotics at levels below killing phase, because that subclinical or sub-effective dose is sustaining that population to much more, it's not killing them, so they continue to reproduce, and the negative effects of that drug, they're going to develop strategies or proportions of the population that are getting better at surviving. In other words, the weak ones are going to die, but the stronger ones are going to keep surviving and keep breeding. And so it's very important when it comes to the farmers out there listening to this, that they understand that if you're going to treat an animal with an antibiotic, the first thing to understand is this use of this antibiotic, is that in the same vogue as what your veterinarian has allowed you to have this drug for that appropriate use. So for instance, there's veterinary orders out there on dairy farms, for instance, that will quite rightly ensure that farmers have access to penicillin, let's say, as a nice easy example, for the use of foot disease in dairy cows, for instance, infectious foot disease, and that has a large reliance on that dairy farmer, one that he's going to use that antibiotic for that appropriate reason. And if there's another reason or another problem, it's probably not a great idea just to grab the penicillin and assume it's going to have the same effect.
So